The ceasefire is on life support. That is the word from Washington. But here is what almost no one is telling you. The most dangerous development in this conflict is not the one dominating the headlines, not the one being debated in Tel Aviv war rooms or shouted across American cable news. It is something quieter, something methodical, something that, when it finally arrives, will look nothing like the wars we have been trained to expect. It will not begin with a roar. It will not announce itself with a dramatic explosion or a presidential declaration. It will begin with silence. The silence of a port that has stopped moving. The silence of a highway severed at its spine. The silence of a runway so precisely shattered that no aircraft, no matter how urgently needed, can safely touch down. And when that silence descends across the region, the most capable military force in the Middle East will have, at most, a matter of days before it begins consuming its own strength from within. What you're about to hear is not political commentary. It is not partisan framing. It is arithmetic. It is the cold, unforgiving mathematics of how modern warfare actually functions once you strip away the flags, the rhetoric, and the comfortable myths that powerful governments use to reassure their publics. There is a conversation that serious military analysts have been conducting behind closed doors for months. A conversation that the political class on both sides of the Atlantic has been either too distracted to engage with, too imprisoned by old assumptions to initiate, or simply too afraid to speak aloud. That conversation is about what Iran has actually been doing beneath the surface of all those dramatic satellite images and intercepted drone footage that flood our news cycles. And when you stop watching the theater, when you examine the operational behavior with the cold, disciplined eye of someone who genuinely understands how modern armies breathe and eat and move, the picture that emerges is not merely alarming. For those willing to see it without flinching, it is clarifying in a way that changes everything. A modern army does not run on courage. That is a sentiment for monuments and memorial services. A modern army runs on logistics, on fuel measured in hundreds of thousands of liters per brigade per day of combat, on ammunition consumed in thousands of rounds across just a few hours of sustained fire, on food, water, spare parts, and medical supplies flowing through an invisible architecture of ports, depots, roads, and rail lines. Sever that architecture, and the most sophisticated weapon system on Earth becomes, within days, nothing more than an extraordinarily expensive and completely immovable piece of metal. The Roman legions understood this 2,000 years ago. Napoleon learned it in the most catastrophic way imaginable on the frozen road to Moscow. The German Wehrmacht rediscovered it in the endless Russian steppes. And right now, in the ancient and bitterly contested land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, an adversary that has studied this lesson with extraordinary patience and surgical precision is positioning itself to apply it in full. An advisor to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated publicly and without hesitation that Iranian military facilities are so vast they have yet to demonstrate even a majority of their actual capabilities. The same source claimed Iran possesses sufficient strike capacity to hit Israel every single day for 2 full years without exhausting its arsenal. Read that again. Not weeks, not months, 2 years of daily strikes. And yet the conversation in Western capitals remains obsessively fixated on air defense intercept rates and Iron Dome statistics, as though the only question that matters is whether any given missile gets through. That is a fundamental misreading of the strategic stakes. The real question is not about intercept percentages. The real question is this: what happens when Iran stops aiming at military bases and starts aiming at the infrastructure that allows those military bases to function at all? Hard data from the opening weeks of the 2026 conflict reveals that Iranian missile attacks against Israel were sustained across multiple consecutive days. Even as Israel conducted continuous airstrikes against Iranian launch facilities, Tehran absorbed that pressure without stopping. It probed, it measured, it assessed Israeli response times with scientific precision. It identified gaps in radar coverage. It catalogued which specific targets produced which defensive reactions. Every single volley was simultaneously a weapon and an intelligence collection instrument. That kind of operational patience is not the behavior of a regime acting from desperation. That is the behavior of a state that genuinely believes time and target selection are both on its side. Israel has three major ports through which external military supplies arrive: Haifa in the north, Ashdod on the central Mediterranean coast, and Eilat on the Red Sea. These three facilities collectively represent the circulatory entry points of Israeli military sustainment. They are not merely logistically important, they are existentially important. Without functioning ports, Israel cannot receive bulk ammunition shipments, heavy equipment, aviation fuel, or the enormous tonnage of material that sustained military operations absolutely require. The question Iran has been quietly answering through its probing strikes over recent months is not whether it can hit those ports. That capability has already been demonstrated. The question is whether Iran can destroy the specific infrastructure required to actually offload cargo: the cranes, the fuel lines, the rail connections, the staging facilities. Can it strike these in sufficient numbers and with sufficient precision that maritime resupply becomes impossible regardless of how many ships Washington dispatches to the region? This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition derived from observable Iranian operational behavior. The question is not whether Tehran has developed this capability. Based on everything the evidence shows, it has. The question that should be keeping every serious strategist awake at night is when, and under what specific conditions, Iran will choose to use it. Consider the arithmetic of military logistics at the operational level, because this is where abstract strategic theory collides with the irreversible physical reality of armies in the field. An Israeli armored brigade conducting active operations does not consume fuel at the rate of a civilian commuter. It consumes approximately 180,000 liters daily, accounting for tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, engineering equipment, and the logistics convoys sustaining the brigade itself. Multiply that figure across all deployed Israeli armored formations, and total daily fuel consumption runs into millions of liters. Israel's forward units maintain fuel stocks sufficient for perhaps 3 to 5 days of operations. That buffer is designed to absorb short-term logistics disruptions. It is emphatically not designed to sustain military operations when the logistics system itself has been severed at its source. Artillery presents a parallel mathematics problem. A single artillery battalion firing at sustained rates can expend hundreds of rounds in a single day. Across all deployed artillery systems during active operations, daily ammunition consumption runs into thousands of rounds. Add tank main gun ammunition, anti-tank guided missiles, mortar rounds, and precision-guided munitions for aircraft, and the total daily consumption figure becomes staggering in scale. The forward ammunition depots holding these stockpiles exist to enable continuous operations while rear area resupply flows. If that flow stops, if the magazines are burning and the trucks cannot move because the bridges are down, then what an Israeli unit has in its immediate possession at the moment of interdiction is precisely and exactly all it will ever have. Once consumed, it is gone. Let us walk through what Iran's targeting logic would actually mean in sequential terms if and when it shifts to logistics infrastructure. The first phase would not aim to sink ships in open water. That is Hollywood. That is not how this works. Phase 1 would aim to destroy the specific mechanical and civil infrastructure required to move cargo from ship to shore at Israel's port facilities. Container cranes, fuel offloading systems, rail connections, bonded warehouses. Destroy those systems and the ships waiting offshore become completely irrelevant. Their cargo is inaccessible. Phase 2 would not waste expensive munitions on individual vehicles. That is inefficient. Phase 2 would strike the infrastructure those vehicles cannot bypass. Bridge crossings on primary logistics corridors, rail bridges, highway overpasses, tunnels representing unavoidable choke points. When you destroy a bridge, you do not simply stop the vehicles currently crossing it. You stop every vehicle that needs to use that route until the bridge is rebuilt. And in a nation the size of Israel, with a limited number of major north-south and east-west corridors, destroying multiple bridges simultaneously does not create a traffic problem. It creates a strangulation. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz following the February 2026 US-Israeli strikes, it demonstrated precisely this logic of infrastructure as warfare, severing not armies directly, but the arteries that feed them. That strait closure was a proof of concept at the macro level. Applied at the operational level against Israel's internal logistics network, the same concept becomes a vice rather than a blockade, tightening incrementally and invisibly until the force depending on that network can no longer sustain itself in the field. Phase 3 is the most unsettling component of this analysis, and it is the one that most directly challenges the comfortable assumption that classified information provides security. Israel maintains a dispersed network of forward logistics depots, hardened facilities containing pre-positioned ammunition, fuel, and supplies designed to sustain operations when rear area logistics come under pressure. The locations of these facilities are among the most closely guarded secrets in Israeli military planning. And yet, Iranian strikes in recent months have repeatedly hit facilities whose military functions were not publicly acknowledged. Facilities where satellite imagery subsequently revealed ammunition storage bunkers, fuel tank farms, and pre-positioned equipment. That kind of targeting intelligence does not accumulate by accident. It represents years of systematic intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Human intelligence, signals intelligence, commercial satellite imagery analysis, conducted with a patience and thoroughness that Western assessments have consistently underestimated. Then there is the compensating mechanism that American planners instinctively reach for when confronted with logistics vulnerability: emergency strategic airlift. The United States maintains substantial heavy airlift capacity, C-17 Globemasters and C-5 Galaxies capable of moving enormous quantities of cargo over transcontinental distances. But strategic airlift requires functioning airfields with runways long enough and structurally sound enough to receive heavy aircraft. Iranian strikes during the 2026 conflict closed Israeli airspace for several days, disrupting operations at Ben Gurion and other airports across the country. Iranian planners understand with absolute precision that disabling runways does not require destroying entire airports. It requires creating subsurface craters of sufficient depth and number on runway surfaces to prevent heavy aircraft from landing safely. Achieve that at Ben Gurion, Ramon, and the relevant Israeli Air Force facilities, and American strategic airlift, regardless of how many aircraft are waiting on tarmacs at Dover and Travis, delivers absolutely nothing. As of May 15, 2026, Iran has declared it has not agreed on uranium enrichment terms with the United States. Nuclear negotiations remain completely stalemated, and President Trump himself has told Iran it can either strike a deal or face annihilation. The diplomatic language is hardening by the day. The rhetorical temperature is rising past the boiling point. And within that rising temperature, the critical analytical question is not whether these parties want war. Rational actors rarely want war in the abstract. The question is whether the conditions for catastrophic miscalculation have already been created. Whether the gap between what each side believes the other will accept and what the other will actually accept has grown wide enough that the next escalatory step lands not on a negotiating table, but on a logistics depot that Israel simply cannot afford to lose. So what is Israel's answer? What does a strategic response to a logistics interdiction campaign actually look like? And here, any honest analyst must confront an uncomfortable truth, one that challenges the deeply held narrative of Israeli military invulnerability. There is no clean answer, not because Israeli military planners are incompetent, they manifestly are not, but because the vulnerabilities being exploited are structural. They are embedded in the physical geography of a small country with limited port access, constrained road and rail corridors, and a forward-deployed military consuming material at rates that peacetime resupply infrastructure was never designed to sustain under sustained precision strike. Israel cannot prevent Iranian missiles from reaching their targets in volumes sufficient to achieve logistics interdiction objectives. Hard data confirms that even under continuous Israeli airstrikes targeting Iranian launch facilities, Tehran maintains sustained missile fire. The intercept rate is not zero, but it never was and never will be perfect. In a logistics interdiction scenario, the attacker does not need perfection. The attacker needs to damage enough critical nodes that the system as a whole collapses. A single destroyed crane at Haifa does not stop the port, but 3 destroyed cranes plus the fuel offloading system plus the primary rail connection to the inland distribution network, that may well stop it entirely. Israel cannot rapidly repair the kind of damage that a sustained precision campaign against infrastructure would create. We are not discussing pothole repair. We are discussing the reconstruction of specialized port equipment with manufacturing lead times measured in months. the rebuilding of bridge structures requiring extensive civil engineering, the remediation of runway damage that prevents heavy aircraft operations. These are not problems that national will and military discipline can solve within the operational time window that matters. The United States cannot compensate through emergency resupply at the pace required. A single large container vessel carries more cargo than many dozens of C-17 sorties. Sustaining an army of 120,000 troops through airlift alone, when the ports are closed and the runways are cratered, is not a logistics management challenge. It is a physical impossibility at the relevant timescale. The conditional ceasefire declared on April 8th came only after weeks of devastating exchanges. Talks since then have repeatedly stalled and fractured. The ceasefire bought time. That is all it did. It did not resolve the underlying strategic asymmetry this analysis has been describing. And yet, and this is a point that intellectual honesty demands be stated clearly, deterrence is not the same as inevitability. Iran has not yet executed this targeting campaign. The existence of the capability does not mean the decision to employ it has been made. Talks mediated by Pakistan continue, and both parties have returned to the table repeatedly, even as ceasefire terms remain hotly contested. There are actors on multiple sides of this conflict who understand the escalatory logic described here and are working, with varying degrees of desperation and effectiveness, to prevent it from completing itself. But history teaches us what no amount of diplomatic optimism can fully answer. Capabilities that exist get used. Strategic advantages carefully prepared across years of patient intelligence collection and operational development do not dissolve because negotiators are meeting in Pakistani conference rooms. They remain available. They remain tempting. And in any future moment when Iran calculates that the costs of restraint exceed the costs of action, when pressure from domestic audiences, from military commanders, from the internal logic of the conflict itself tips the balance, the option will be there, waiting. What Washington and Tel Aviv owe their publics is not reassurance. Reassurance, in the face of what the evidence actually shows, would be negligence dressed in the costume of leadership. What they owe is honest acknowledgement that a strategic vulnerability of genuine severity has been allowed to develop, that the adversary has demonstrated both the capability and the intelligence preparation to exploit it, and that the answer to that vulnerability cannot be found in more interceptor missiles or more diplomatic communiques alone. It requires a fundamental reassessment of how modern military power actually functions, not in theory, not in the comfortable abstractions of think tank white papers, but in the grinding, material, logistical reality of armies that need fuel and ammunition and food every single day to remain armies. The shock, when it comes, will not be that it happened. The shock will be that everyone paying close attention could see it coming, in plain sight, in the data, in the patterns, and that almost nobody in a position of authority chose to say so plainly, while there was still time to do something about it.